Hello everyone, and welcome to BHD Studios, and welcome to my latest video. Now, I have a little story I got to tell about three SLs that you know so well. It started way back in 2015 with this one right here, the Leica SL Typ 601. Now this camera is pretty cool because for like many of us, we weren't around in 1954 when the original M3 came out, or even back in 1925 when the first Leica 1 came out. But a lot of us were around in 2016 was really when most people started getting these cameras in their hands, but October of 2015 was when this camera was announced. And so we're talking like this year, October, will be the 10-year anniversary of the Leica SL, and this year is also the 100th anniversary of Leica making cameras. The company itself is over 150 years old, but it's pretty cool to see three generations of Leica SLs. Now here I have the new SL3S, and over here is the SL2 that came out in 2019, but again, it's a kind of a 2020 camera, and this thing came out last year in March of 2024, the regular SL3, and this just came out. But we've been around for all three generations, and it's kind of cool to see all three of them. I thought it'd be kind of cool to go through all three of them and kind of go through the history of the evolution of the SL system, because I remember when this came out in 2015, 2016, and I mention this all the time, that Chris and Jordan, when they're at TCS TV, they rated this like worst camera of the year, and understandably, they're a camera store, they needed to sell these, and at kind of, I wouldn't say the height of the A7, but it was a pretty darn popular mirrorless camera, and when you compare this chunky camera right here to the A7 series, you couldn't have a greater contrast. This was a brick compared to the Sony. The Sony was, a couple generations in, and they had really had their S-Log for the video, and they had all their video features from, decades of making camcorders and stuff like that, down pat. Or Leica, this was their first attempt at a full-featured mirrorless camera that was, I don't want to say compete with Sony, but, in that kind of autofocus, being able to do videos and stills, this was Leica's first attempt, and I love this camera. If you've been following me for years, maybe this is the reason why you started watching my videos, and I made quite a few videos on all of these, but on the original SL, I did an unboxing, my first look and impressions. I did a video showing me using the adapter to put M-mount lenses, so I've had a good time with this camera when this was still brand new. And of course, the Sony and the Canon and the Nikons, especially with the DSLRs, performed better than this. But this was a new chapter for Leica, and I understood, like, hey, if you're in the Leica ecosystem, this is kind of what you want. And so, first gen product, we're going to be patient and we're going to see its evolution. But recently I posted an insert with my interview with Andreas Kaufmann at Wetzlar back in 2021, where he talked about the design of the SL. So I'll insert it again here.
Well, especially I'm running around at the moment with the SL2S. Yeah, and with this smaller zoom lens, the 2470, because it's easier for traveling. I think that was a huge design step because we wanted to get something more brutal looking. Because the predecessor was our R system, which we stopped in 2009, and there was a huge time lag in between 2009 until 2016. And then we said in the design process, and it did take quite long, so these kind of design processes take over a year. It has to look as a huge step, 2 or 3 steps ahead, and I think we made it possible because it's still a sort of more brutal statement by Leica.
And so, as Dr. Kaufmann had mentioned, this really was a continuation of the Leica R series, right? From the original SL2, the Leica Flex series, all throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, and finally the R8 and R9. Those were like chunky, aggressive, big cameras. And Leica liked that because it was kind of in contrast to the M series. And this was a continuation of that. And so this was built out of 2 pieces of solid aluminum. You can feel it in the weight, but the handle and the grip is really nice. And the way they designed this was a mini S. Now, those you might not know, S is Leica's medium format camera, and it still hasn't been updated, and I'm really waiting. Photographers like Todd Heidel loves the S, and you can see the images that he's been able to create with it, but this was based on that. One thing you can tell is with these 4 unmarked buttons here, very unusual. A lot of people complained about it, but I like it, and if they brought it back, Take would be happy. The beauty of these 4 buttons, when you tap it once, you could see what the 4 features can do, and you can customize it. But there's also a long press, right? So here, long press is set to ISO. This one here, long press is set to white balance. This one here, long press is set to your drive mode. And then this one here, long press is set to the autofocus mode. So single, continuous, and manual focus. And so you basically had 8 custom function buttons in the back here. But what hasn't changed between all 3 of these is that this was the first of the SLs to have this particular battery, right? Now this first showed up in the Leica T, and then also it's in the original Q as well. But this battery is interchangeable between all 3 of these. It's the same one. It's the same battery that's in the SL2, which is the BP SL4. And the new one, I think, is the BP SL6. So it has higher capacity. But you can use this battery and move them between all 3 of them, as well as the overall design. I mean, you could tell it looks pretty much the same. They all have the deep grip. They all have this big control knob on the top here, and this control knob, there is no drive shaft that goes into the body. It's actually connected through magnets, and that's what helps keep all the SLs weather sealed. With IP54 rating, that's a pretty high standard. They all have the top screen here, and they all have this kind of this faux pentaprism, but it is useful in that it is housing this quite large EVF. And they also all share this same joystick, same rear dial with the push-in feature. I think even the same door. Although we'll see later on in the SL3, this has changed what's inside, but door feels exactly the same way it opens. So if you shot at either of these 2, you'll easily navigate your way through the original SL Type 601. But what makes this unique is, people might be wondering, well, what's with that little hump there? And that right there is the GPS unit. So this camera doesn't need to connect to your iPhone or your smartphone. And because GPS can't be inside metal, it is mounted on the outside. So aesthetically, it looks a little goofy, but that's the only way to get GPS. So all your JPEGs and RAW file embedded with your GPS time and location. So if you travel the world, you take photos anywhere, I think this is really cool. And I would love for future SLs, find a place like, if you can, to put it in there, because imagine having the contact credentials as well as a GPS reader. That'd be awesome. Another thing you'll notice is that the strap lugs have always been slotted this style, which I like the eyelet lugs better. But if you notice, see how sleek this is? It's just right into the body here. And the next 2 generations, it sticks out. And so I love how it's embedded. So at least it's nice and smooth. You can't catch it on anything. You won't hook on anything. It just makes everything a little bit more tight over here. And so this is the original SL. It is a digital classic. I know a lot of people that love their SLs, and even if they've moved on to the SL2 or the SL3, a lot of them will keep it. And you can get these recently priced used, depending on the condition, anywhere between $1,200 to $2,000 based on the condition, and if you can get boxes and things like that. But this is still a chonker. This is quite big and heavy. But considering the type of lenses you're probably mounting on this, it wasn't too bad. And then we can move on here. Let's move on. Let's switch places here. Move on to actually my favorite of all the SLs is the SL2. In terms of design, I like the look of this better than the other 2. I think that it has matured from them. I mean, the SL still looks pretty cool. It is nice that it has that kind of all metal look, but there is no kind of rubberized leatherette in here. So it looks a little plain in the center area, and in the grip here, as good as that grip was, it is nicer here because Leica put a little rubber strip. So even though the SL was nice, this feels much nicer in your hand here when you're shooting with it. And then with that leatherette, you see that leather all the way through here? It has a nice texture to it. Instead of the 1 button, now you got 2 buttons over here, 2 customizable buttons. The 2 buttons on top here, instead of it being silver like on the SL, they're now blacked out, and you have that long press so you can quickly adjust any of the custom functions. So that's an FN button here, 2 FNs here, 2 FNs over here. Very easy to customize your buttons. Now what you do lose though is the sleekness. See how the strap lugs stick out now? I don't know why they did it. I think it's maybe for space because it's starting to get really tight in here. And as well, if you notice the flash, the shoe mount here, it's no longer flush to this little pentaprism or faux pentaprism hump there, so it sticks out a little bit. But if you look at the back, you can see it's still really tight where the EVF is, and it's really tight in here. And I think for that sake, even though we're just talking like 2 millimeters, it made enough of a difference for Leica to be like, well, we need the space. Let's just move that flash shoe mount up a little bit to make space. And I think that's probably why they did the same thing with these strap lugs, is that they just wanted that little bit of extra space over here. And so they decided to just move it out so you get a little bit more finger space here. But see how I can feel that right there? See that? I don't like that feeling. So if you're not using a strap, you always feel that lug over here. Now, in terms of the buttons, they simplified it to make the 3 buttons on the left side instead of the 4, which I still prefer. I do like those unmarked buttons because then you can set it to whatever you want. Other than that top left is, I think, the access to the main menu. That one you can't change. Has the same on and off switch. No longer the GPS unit, which is also a shame, even though in terms of aesthetics, this looks much prettier without it. You also lost the, on the bottom here, it's lined to the center of the mount, which is great, but you lost the, I don't know what you call it, it's that extra hole to keep your tripod plate from shifting, especially when you're using heavier lenses. That hole is there, and it's in the SL3, but it's missing from the SL2, so I don't know why it's missing, but they brought it back, which is great. Again, the same battery as the original SL, but overall, for me, the look, the balance, these overall kind of design, I like the maturity between the SL and the SL2, and I still think the SL2 is the most handsome of all the 3 SLs. Even the Leica script, if you look at it carefully, it looks like they went a little bit thicker on the Leica. See the font? Maybe it's hard to tell in camera here, but definitely the SL2 Leica script is a little bit thicker, and so when you got the SL2S, it makes sense when you black it out. I think a lot of people see this. When I have this around, and I'm thinking, well, this looks more like a DSLR. Will people know it's a Leica? Well, they'll know because it says Leica. And it's funny, when I'm carrying this around, quite a few people say, hey, that's a beautiful camera. And I think all they see is the Leica and the red dot. I probably would also prefer if it was a little bit thinner like that, or smaller, or just completely blacked out. Because overall, I still think this is a really handsome looking camera. And the SL2 also improved on the I/O. The original SL, because it's a 2015-2016 camera, it had that weird, here I'll show you, it had that weird micro B USB-C connector there, and it had that weird kind of, it's the headphone, microphone, and I think remote control jack, but I think you need some kind of an adapter or something to use it. So a little bit antiquated. But again, for 2015, having a full-size HDMI was really nice. And also with the with this rubberized door, which is nice, what they did was, if you're just going to use a USB-C port, which is this bottom one here, you can keep this closed and just open the bottom. You see that? And the SL3 has that as well. I think that's a nice touch. Some people complained that they wanted like more of a hard door, but again, I think for the IP54 rating, it is nice to have this whole thing rubber instead of a thin little strip of rubber. Like for instance, on the bottom of the battery compartment, there's a little thin piece of rubber in here to keep it weather sealed. But when it comes to your I/O, I think it's really important when you're not using it, when you keep it shut, you want to make sure that you don't have any dust getting in or any water or moisture getting in here. But overall, again, I still think this is the most handsome. Biggest complaint is the strap lug sticking out. It's a really small complaint, but having that flash hot shoe connector sticking out of the top instead of it being really smooth at the top. Now let's finally move over to the latest and greatest SL3. Again, this is the SL3S because you do have that blacked out logo, but besides that, this is externally identical to the SL3. Now, Leica went out of the way to make sure this was smaller and lighter. These two cameras here, solid aluminum, basically the same weight, and they shaved off a few grams, made it a little bit thinner and a little bit shorter. And to be honest, unless you have both in your hands, it's really hard to tell. And they also added an articulating screen, which is really solid. This is one thing Leica always shows in saying, do other manufacturers allow you to hold their LCD screen articulated out and holding it out like this? That's how strong and confident Leica is with their articulating screen. So the build quality is still just as good, but instead of it being solid aluminum, they've mixed in with magnesium alloy. So it's a mixture of aluminum. So I'm assuming the top and bottom plates are aluminum, and then the midsection slash the skeletal chassis part of it is probably magnesium alloy. And they did a lot to just shrink it just slightly, a little bit. And I don't think the Germans are famous for miniaturization. I think that's really a Japanese thing to make things smaller. So for the Germans to make this just slightly smaller without compromising on the build quality, it was a pretty big feat. And one thing they had to do, I know we're not really talking about internals, and in fact, maybe I didn't mention at the beginning of the video, which is we're not talking about megapixels, or we're not talking about processors or performance or anything. We're talking more about the evolution of the design from the SL to the latest SL3. Just quickly to talk about it, by making everything a little bit smaller, they actually changed the shutter between the SL2 and the SL3. And you could hear the difference in the video. I actually let you guys hear it. If you notice, the shutter sound was, listen to that. And here is the SL2. Definitely a different sound, right? I prefer the sound of the SL2 shutter, and the SL2 shutter is actually a higher performing shutter. It has a faster flash sync, 1/250th versus 1/200th, and it just has a nicer sound to it. It's quieter. But again, for the compromise of making this a little bit smaller, they still had the camera lighter while still adding an articulating screen and still maintaining an IP54 rating. So I think it's a pretty good feat for Leica. Now again, because they made this smaller, it made sense to leave the strap lugs on the outside, especially now because the SL3 has this extra dial on the outside, so there just is no space to do what they did with the SL, right? Where it's just integrated into the body. I mean, look how beautiful that is. And again, you can see that flash, see how it's just smooth like that? And like the SL2, the SL3, it's just, it sticks out like that. But even if it sticks out again, if you look at the back, where's the space for it, right? The EVF is right there. There's just barely like a 1/4 inch down here, and then bang, you have the articulating LCD screen. So there's no space for it. So I totally understand why, but the lines on the SL is actually nicer. And of these three, I would say this has like the coolest design. Number 2, I would pick the original SL. And then finally, this is not a not pretty camera, but it's definitely a more functional with the 2 dials, with it being smaller, with the LCD screen. But in terms of design, I still prefer these two. One thing I do really appreciate, it's a very subtle one, but they put like a little step. Can you see that little line there? It's a little step, and kind of Apple does this as well. You know, with the MacBook Air, how they kind of taper to the edge, and you only see the edge of the MacBook Air, right? So you think, oh, this laptop is this thin, but really in the middle, it's as thick as the MacBook Pro. And I think they're doing the same thing here. This is slightly, I mean, I can't show you like this, but this is overall slightly lower than the SL2, and it's slightly narrower. But by adding that little step, it feels like this is the actual top plate. That little step there gives the illusion that there's kind of this top panel is kind of floating a little bit. I actually got to interview David Suh, who is from Vancouver, and he was on the design team that designed the SL3.
So that was also one of our main goals, to make the size as compact as possible. So of course there are many constraints that we have to go through, but in a very harmonious way we try to resolve it. So such as the body is, the parts are out of, SL2 was out of aluminum, for example, but SL3 now has magnesium, so that we try to count every single milligrams of the parts to reduce the overall body weight, and also the proportion and everything.
As well as Mark Shippert, who's the head of design. I actually had a chance to interview them last year in Wetzlar.
And the SL1 itself is quite a very abstract design, so it's quite slab-sided, very monolithic even. And what we did for moving forward to the SL2, we actually looked a little bit to the heritage. So what came earlier in terms of SLR cameras from not just the Leica Flex and things like that, but more in the R series. So what characteristics, what design elements could we reinterpret into a mirrorless camera for the next generation of the SL? So you started to see a few things coming actually from the reference from the past moving towards the future.
And so I will eventually post these videos. I have a long-term video in mind for all my interviews. But you know, stuff like this button here, this on and off button, people are wondering, well, why did they put it there? Well, all three of these have the on and off switch here. And it is true, a lot of us forget that it's on or off. We forget that it's there. And because of it, I understand why they did this. You do get used to the fact that when you do a light press, you take it out of sleep mode, or you could do a half press on the shutter button, or if you do a long press, you do completely turn, there you go, so you can hear that. It completely turns off, and now a half press doesn't turn it on. So you can still turn it on and off, but the fact that the button is here makes sense because, well, the internal architecture between all three models is probably pretty much the same. Like the battery slots in the same spot, the memory cards are on the same spot, the IO's on the same spot. So for them to move this switch to somewhere else is probably going to be kind of a bigger deal. And so I think this button here has to be here. But the fact that you have the second dial, you still have a reason for your hand to be here. You can see between the SL3 and the SL2, they moved the buttons, right? On the left side, I never liked the buttons on here, but this is a two-handed camera. But I love to be able to shoot and then press play. Your finger's right there. Or this one here, you had to shoot and then you have to press your hand on this side. Although I guess you could have customized any of these buttons to be play or like a second play button. But the reason why Leica moved it primarily is because of the articulating screen, right? You want the screen sort of centered to the mount, and to do that, you can't have the buttons here. So the buttons were moved over here, and then the on and off button was kind of, I always say it's orphaned in this corner here, but you do have this dial here, so you still have a reason for your hand to be up in this corner, which includes the on and off switch. There's more connection between the SL2 and the SL3, and all the changes they did were so subtle that the average person might not see it. Like for instance, even here, you see that little, I was talking about that little step that you have over here. Well, there's also quite a bit more gap right here. Can you see that? Where the shutter button here is. There's a little bit of a gap to give more space. And this one here, as you see, there is no gap. See that? So where your finger is here and where the dial is, they're a lot closer and tighter together. I haven't decided which I prefer, but this is more prominent, the distinction between the shutter button and the top dial. So maybe this was something that David and Mark thought about, kind of help a little bit with the ergonomics. This feels nice, but I still think that because this is a little bit taller, if you have bigger hands, you'll probably prefer the SL. Of all these three, you probably will prefer the feel of the SL2. And if you still want more grippage on this, you can get either the bottom grip or get a third-party hand grip to kind of extend the bottom here. So that's my overall look here at these three cameras from a design perspective. Again, the more I look, I notice little things like even like the angle of this little hump here. They all have a slightly different angle. This thing here is more straight, and then the angle here, as you can see that angle there? It's way less aggressive. See that? The most aggressive one is the new SL3. It's way more aggressive than the other two here. And oddly enough, there is a little, you can see that little circle and in the middle there that shows you where the sensor plane is, which isn't in the other two cameras. And as well as I mentioned, the return of that little extra hole there to stabilize your tripod plate. So that's come back on the SL3. Has a better battery in here. But again, I'm not talking about sensors or any of the processors. Obviously, as you go up from 2015, 2019, 2024, obviously you're going to see improvements in all those. And it was smart for Leica to make this a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, as well as to put the articulating screen. But it would be nice, because the Leica CL is now gone, and that was an APS-C camera. Someone had said in my comments, why don't they make a Q3 an interchangeable lens camera system? And I kind of understand what they're saying is kind of like a CL/Q full frame, but without this huge hump, and it doesn't have to be IP54 rated, just a compact full frame L-mount camera. If that will be possible, I think that would be kind of cool. But I think the point of Leica is when you have an SL, you're going to have big chunkin lenses. Like here is the beautiful 35 apochromatic Summicron. And when you put lenses like this on cameras like this, I think it looks a little off when it's on a camera body the size of a Q or a CL. But typically how I shoot is right here. So I do have the Light Lens Lab helicoid adapter with my beloved 28 Summicron. And going right back to the original SL, if you look at the thumbnail, I think, of the M mount video I did, it is basically this lens right here. And so this is how I typically go out with my SL when I'm shooting, because this is my favorite lens. Being able to have an EVF for critical focusing, the punch in quickly with the EVF, and with the helicoid, I can go 0.7 and then activate the helicoid and get down to like, I don't know, 26, 27 centimeters, so get really close, which has transformed this lens. I mean, I still love my M-mount bodies when I'm shooting for fun, when I'm shooting for street, but other times it's nice to have the convenience of an EVF, convenience of IP54 rated, even though the lens isn't, and then be able to swap out and put Sigma lenses, Panasonic, or Leica's own lenses, and have these as well weather sealed, but also having autofocus. Alright, so thank you so much for watching. Let me know which is your favorite SL, or maybe you own all three series. Maybe you just got the SL3 and you're curious about the SL2 or the original SL. I think really the SL for me is, other than people love this sensor, I think having GPS is just so cool that you can just travel the world with this beautiful camera and be able to record your time and date and your GPS coordinates embedded directly into your XF data is really sweet. And I've seen I've taken amazing photos with the SL, and you still can with this camera. This is also 24 megapixels, but of course it's a video monster, and as well the SL3 has 60 megapixels. This here is kind of the dark horse. A lot of people don't like the 47 megapixel sensor in here. I love it. I don't mind the noise. I love the uniqueness of the sensor. And right now, in terms of price performance, this is the best value Leica interchangeable lens camera that you can buy right now. And so check out my friends over at Camera West. I'll put links down below. It's not an affiliate link, but it lets them know that I've sent you there. They have a solid stock of SL2s and SL2Ss. They even have an SL as well. They sell the SL3 and the SL3S brand new. It's hard to find these things used. But look at the pricing of this. I think right now, I saw a price of $2,200 to about $2,900 for an SL2. And for an SL2S, which is the video-centric version of the SL, you can for about the same price. And so check them out. If you want to get into Leica interchangeable lens, especially in M mount, you might think, well, I have to get an M mount camera, and you don't. You can start off with an SL2, get the adapter, shoot M mount with this Leica, and eventually you can buy an M mount, and then all the lenses that you've bought for the SL, the M mount ones, you can still use on your M, and still have the option of buying Sigma, Panasonic, and Leica's own L mount lenses. So I think this is a great deal. I'm having a great time. Thank you very much, Camera West, for sending this camera to me. I still use it all the time. Let me know if you have any questions down below, but also again, let me know which of these cameras you would like, or that you own, or you would like to buy. So thank you so much for watching, and happy shooting. Actually, here, let me just crank this a little bit here. Thank you, Retro Photo Reading, for sending this to me to play with. This is the Leica 3C with the Leica motor. We'll talk to you soon, and happy shooting. Peace.